Last week we had an introduction to it, and an introduction to the Tabernacle. And we're going to get into each week, we'll get into it just a little bit deeper. Excuse me, as we go, my allergies are going crazy. Probably some of you are experiencing the same thing. Got watery eyes, you know. Okay, we are at the Tabernacle, and it starts off with God saying, get ready. There it is. Get ready. God designated for his nation of Israel that they were going to move. They were going to be moving around. And he designates the assignments all the way through to his nation of Israel as to how they're to proceed, rather, into their journey. They're going to be wandering for 40 years. They don't know that yet, but God does. And he sets out to protect the children of Israel. So he makes the assignments as how to proceed in that journey. And it'll be the duty then of the Israelites to guard and protect and defend the tabernacle. So what Moses is really going to be doing in this 40 years, not just religious training, but also military training. He's going to turn a nation of slaves into a nation of an army, of an armed force, so to speak. I just watched yesterday Spartacus, and that was where he assembled a bunch of slaves to fight the Roman government. And I thought about Israel being the same way. They were preparing to fight for the Promised Land. And so they were going to be spending 40 years in that preparation. So then they will become a national army, and what's my next slide? Here we go. There it is. And he told Moses, take a census so we know how many we're starting with for the army, a census for the men over 20. And I believe I know they didn't include the Levites. So you only had the men out of the other 12 tribes, 20 years old or older, that were able to fight, and it came out to 603,500 people, men, exclusive of the Levites. So that's kind of begins to give us an idea of how large an army this was going to be, how large this nation is at this particular point. Another census they'll take 38 years later when they're getting ready to go into the Promised Land had 601,730 men. That was 1,700 less men than when they started. So they were actually going into the Promised Land with less soldiers, if you would, soldier age persons, draft age, if you want to use that, before they could go in, excuse me, into the Promised Land. There was approximately 3 million people, they estimate. That's men, women, children, their livestock, and their possessions, all going out into the desert. Talk about a logistic nightmare. It's a good thing God was in charge, because I don't think Moses would have been able to handle anything close to that at that particular point. So we had 12 tribes, and we'll kind of look at those today because this is part of the biography. This is part of the influence around that tabernacle. Of course, they were Jacob's sons, 12 sons, as Israel as he became. There's descendants, and you can see those in Genesis 29 and 30. They list those out for you, very plain. I didn't go through that. And then you can see the blessings that was given to the children of Israel in 49 and 1 through 28. And then again, before Moses dies, he blesses the children of Israel in Deuteronomy. So they recognize them at least 3 different places in a total run, so that we have the ability of knowing who they are and where they came from. So we're going to look at that a little bit now. I think Jane's probably still got some of these in her library back there with these tribes. We're going to look at some of their things that they did, their banners, and a little bit about them as we go. Judah was the first one that was mentioned. And this is kind of their banner, Judah the Lion. Judah was the son of Israel, of Jacob, and of Leah, Rachel's older sister. Leah was the one that was given to Jacob, of course, first, and then he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel, the one he intended to have to begin with. And she becomes the most powerful, or the nation rather, becomes the most powerful and becomes the kingdom of Judah, of course. And a lion is a symbol of strength in the Bible. We see that in Genesis 49:9. And it says that Judah is a lion's whelp. And I had to look up whelp because I knew it was like a puppy, you think of, but it also says it was one that was a little bit more antagonistic as far as a puppy or someone called a whelp. They're a little bit more on the fighting side, if you would. So it was also described in Revelations 5:5 as the tribe of Christ. And there it mentions him being the Lion of Judah. Of course, this was the tribe that Jesus descended down through. We had from David right on down the line. David was also out of Judah. The second tribe we'll look at is Issachar. Issachar, I guess it is, not Issachar. And that, you see their symbol there was the sun and the moon for their banner. This was also a son of Leah, often spoken of as being close to Zebulun, the neighbors and partners later in the Promised Land. The sun and the moon represented their descendants and an understanding of the times. And that's in 1 Chronicles 12:32. Later they depend on the Phoenicians because they're carrying their goods from port to port. So they become very much involved in international trade at that particular time by the time they get to the Promised Land. Zebulun is the next one. He was the one that actually was their navy. He becomes their navy in their navigation on the seas for the nation of Israel in the Promised Land. Reuben. I've been thinking, does anybody know that song? It just happened to pop into my head again. Reuben was Leah's firstborn child. Technically, he should have been the leader because he was the firstborn. But if you go back to Genesis 49 and you remember the story, he wound up sleeping with his mother's handmaiden. And as a result, he was kind of demoted in the family, became not the black sheep exactly, but he wasn't going to be the leader of the family either. He intervened to save Joseph's life when they were going to sell Joseph off into slavery. He was the one that stopped them from killing him and said, no, let's sell him instead. Jacob blessed him for his strength and dignity and power, but for the one mistake, he wasn't going to rule. The coat of arms is taken from Genesis 30, and mandrakes of orange, tomato-like fruit. They were called love apples. They were kind of an aphrodisiac, they thought, at that time. And he brought them home. Reuben brought them home to his mother. Remember, the mother was Leah. And so the mother took those and went to Rachel and bought a night with Jacob to spend the night with him. And then the conception of Issachar happened at that particular point. So that's how Issachar got here, was through these love apples, if you would. So, let's see, we got, there it is. Boom, it went. Then we have Levi. This was, of course, the religious group of the children of Israel. Levi was also from Leah, as his mother often spoke of being, the emblem was the ephod, which was what the priests wore around their neck with the 12 tribes of Israel inscribed on each one of those stones that you see there. They, I'll get it in a minute. They would never have their own territory when they got to the Promised Land. They would instead be divided up amongst the children of the tribes of Israel, and they would have cities that were sanctioned cities that they would be at. So they really got cities and not territory that they had, and they got it in each one of the tribe's divisions. These were also part of the Levites, but they were kind of a strange part of the Levites. The Gershon, the Kohath, and the Merari. They were the three sons of Levi. They weren't actually Jacob's sons, but they were included in that family. So they had their little emblem too as well. And all these scriptures you see on the side is where we can find these things, by the way. They were to tend the tabernacle's assembly. They put it together. They took it down, they dismantled it, and they would move it, and they would guard it in the process of the moving. When it stopped, all the tribes would camp around, and they would all guard. But on the journey part of it, when they were moving, it was these guys that were taking care of the moving expenses. So, Simeon, a son of Levi, and a son, or not a son of Levi, excuse me, son of Leah, and also a son of Jacob, of course, but Leah. You notice how many kids Leah's already had, and no mention of Rachel as of yet, because Rachel was a long way from there. So Simeon was one of the strongest tribes in the desert, but later became one of the weakest. And that was the consequence of the losses in the taking of the Promised Land. They almost got wiped out. And they soon were absorbed by the tribe of Judah. So he still had 12 tribes, but some of them were incorporated into the other. And the city of Shechem was later within their boundaries of their settling area. And we hear a lot about Shechem in other stories. But Gad, this was Zilpah. Now Zilpah was a handmaid of Leah. So here's a handmaid now that's contributing to the 12 tribes. It says he would, quote, be trampled by a troop, but would later emerge victorious. Jacob said that in Genesis 49:19. They would be the one that would administer the justice of the Lord. Moses said in Deuteronomy. So if there had to be someone punished, they were the tribe that would do that. And then, of course, there's Benjamin, little Benjamin. Think about him when he comes to Egypt. Rachel dies in giving birth to Benjamin. One of the reasons why he was the favorite of Israel, of Jacob. Rachel dies. He was the youngest son of Jacob and a symbol of a tender young child. But the tribe, on the other hand, became consistently considered warlike and courageous. This was the tribe that Saul would come out of. And I remember the great warrior that Saul was, and how he just stood up head and shoulders above everybody else. That's what happens to Benjamin's tribe. They get very well noted and very well established as the warrior tribe, if you would. We also have Ephraim and Manasseh, the ox and the wild ox. Sometimes referred to as the tribes of Joseph. They were adopted and were blessed just as the others by Jacob, and they stood as chosen children of Israel. These were the adopted boys that came into effect, Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33. The glory of the first bull and the horns of a wild ox, that was their insignia. Naphtali, you see the deer. That was from Bela, also Rachel's handmaiden, represented by a fleeting deer or a gazelle. A deer on the loose, Genesis 49:21 says they were. And they would possess all the south area of the Promised Land when they get to the Promised Land. And last, so we get out of these guys that may be a little more, nope, excuse me, two more. Asher. This was Zilpah. This was Leah's handmaid. So we just had Rachel's handmaid. It had Naphtali, and here's Leah having Asher. The bread shall be rich or fat. They would settle the Promised Land in a very fertile area, to be favored by his brothers and to dip his foot in oil. That's why the olive tree. Olive oil was very, very precious quality. They could use that for currency anywhere. People wanted olive oil. That's what they cooked in and washed in, did all types of things. So that was Asher. I got a kid on my bus named Asher. First guy I ever met. It was the first person ever had that name that I'd ever met, and this little guy. And then last but not least, from the womb of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaiden, was Dan. And Dan was going to be the rear guard of the wilderness wanderings. They would be back in the back. And it says they promised they would judge his people and be a serpent, a viper by the path. That was to bite the horse's heels and the enemy would back up. That's the way the scripture describes them. So Dan was the rear guard, if you would. They were the one that was always walking backwards, kind of looking behind them to see what was coming, if anything was coming. Okay, that kind of covers those 12 tribes in a sense. Here's the way they would line up. If you can see that on there, it may not be big enough. But that was the way you could see their banners. And when they would place their banners in the ground, that's where the tribes would know to assemble. Because they're all wandering around about and they're not following in line exactly. And so they looked for their banner and that's where they would go. They would see the banners. Oh, there's Dan's. That's where I need to go over there. Because there's 3 million people wandering through that desert. So you had to have some way to find where you belong. And that's what that was. And again, we go on to another view of it. I'm pretty sure you can't see that one. I was hoping it would be bigger than that. But it's important because this was not only the way they lined up, but it gives us a kind of a census of how many were there. To the north, which would be the top of that screen there, to the north was Asher, Dan, and Naphtali. That's the way they would line up when they would camp. And then to the east side, which would be to your right, is Issachar and Judah and Zebulun. They would guard the right side of the tabernacle. To the south was Gad and Reuben and Simeon. And then to the west was Manasseh, Ephraim, and Benjamin. So you have a total of 603,550 men over 20 soldiers to guard that precious tabernacle. 3 million people. And if you were an Israelite, of course, you would be wondering, where are we going? You know, we're out in the middle of the desert, and we seem to be Moses kind of wandering around. And that's exactly what they were doing. They didn't have a clue. This wasn't the promised land they knew, but where was the promised land? As far as they were, say, well, it's really, if they knew about it, it's not that far away. Well, how long are we going to take to get there, Moses? How about 40 years? No, they wouldn't have bought into that. But that's what was required for them to go on and be in the promised land, was 40 years of wandering and going through that process. So if you think of the logistics, an unknown destination and no timetable, Moses had his work cut out for him, didn't he? Can you imagine 3 million people and not having somebody grumbling and mumbling? Well, he got a lot of that. It just took a little longer. 3 million people at Mount Sinai march back out into the desert and spend 40 years going toward Israel. If you think of 3 million people, I put this up just to kind of give us a comparison. There's 1.25 million in Oklahoma City, in the metro area. 1.25. They had 3 million. That means that they had 3 times as many people as is in Oklahoma City. 3 million people, 40 years moving under the desert in the guidance of God. It's a good thing he was involved. They would have perished very quickly otherwise. So because the Israelites' lack of faith, I think it's where I'm at on this next, nope, that's breaking camp, excuse me. In order to, I know what I was going to do. Let me back up. Can I do that? Yes, okay. If you think of rush hour, when I used to drive to work before I retired, and you think of rush hour and then add 1.25 million more automobiles that you're trying to get through. And that's what Moses was trying to move through the desert with these people. Every person, if you think about that rush hour, it's 1,250,000 more cars, if you want to break it down. 1.25 million. That's a lot of cars. That's a lot of people. So he really had a hard time with getting it going. And so that when they were breaking camp, there was rules for that. They had rules as they got into camp, how they set up. Well, now we look at the breaking of camp, and you see again those tribes as they're around that tabernacle. And you have on the, they're marching, the beginning on the east side, that's what I want to look for, okay, with Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun on the east, they lead out. And as they get out far enough, then they begin to fall in behind him with Gad, Reuben, and Simeon. And when they pass a certain point and where the others can fall into line, was the western group was Manasseh, and Ephraim, and Benjamin. And finally, from the north was Asher, Naphtali, and who was the last one? Remember? Forgot already. Dan, he was the snake. Remember, he was one that was going to bite the heels of anybody that would attack them. So the tabernacle was still a temporary housing. Well, there's all the guys I forgot to put up. So Judah from the east, south flank moves in second, west third. The tabernacle still, though, had to be a temporary building because they're going to move it. So the journey begins, first of all, the 40 years was because the children of Israel lacked faith. God saw 40 years of wandering to be part of his plans so that all who left Egypt and had lost faith would die except for 2. So for those that were over 20 years old weren't going to make it. If you were 20 years or older, you weren't going to make it. They took care of every need for 40 years. And even though it's portable, the tabernacle had to be designed to be light so they could move it, and yet strong. It's cold in the desert at night, and it's hot in the daytime. And this had to be able to withstand not only the heat and the cold, but the wind and the rain and all the other things that would come upon it. And God provided all their needs miraculously. Even their clothes and shoes wouldn't wear out. I can't imagine wearing the same pair of shoes for 40 years. But that's what it was. They did not wear out. They had shoes and they had clothing, and God provided for them for every need, including their water and all that. In fact, the logistics of 3 million people. This came from the Army Quartermaster and Ancient Hebrew Research Center. And they say that it took 15 to 2,000 tons of food to feed them per day. 3 million people, that much food. 15 to 2,000 tons. Not only that, what about firewood? You got to cook your food. You got to try to keep warm at night. 2,000 to 4,000 tons of wood. We're in the desert, scrub bush. Where'd they get the wood? God provided it. 6.5 to 11 million gallons of water just for their basic needs, washing dishes, their hands, their bodies, and of course for drinking water. It's a lot of water. If you think about it, that's about 3 train loads of tankers full of water. If you think about the tankers that go by on a railroad track, think about that, 3 train loads 1 mile long to keep the water. And yet seeing all this, the children of Israel still lacked faith. It seems amazing to us. Well, I always thought, well, if I was there, I would have understood that. Well, I probably wouldn't have. None of them did. The Israel's camp, what else have I got here? Oh, yeah, there we go. The camp was estimated to be 2.5 by 2.5, 10 square miles. And in that 10 square miles, you would have to walk up to 1.25 miles to use the latrine, the bathroom. They were told to go out of the camp to use the bathroom. So you walked 1.25 miles out to go to the bathroom, and you walked 1.25 miles back. I remember when we were building this extension part of the building, and Mike was over in the office over there on the parking lot where the teen building is now. And he was in there all by himself, and he would have to walk across here to use the bathroom. And he was complaining about it. And I told him, I said, well, look, the Israelites had to walk 1.25 miles. What are you worried for? And of course, that didn't go anywhere with Mike. He was, so I told him, I said, well, at least you got hot and cold running. It's hot in the summertime and cold in the wintertime. So, but that's just an idea of what they would go through while they were in the desert. That's a tremendous thing to do, 1.25 miles. I couldn't walk 1.25 miles now, I think, if I was dying. So, or I would be dying probably if I did. So here's the journey. Now, if you notice this map, probably some of you have in your Bibles, because this is the one that they publish, I think, more than any other, and it shows their journey down through the Sinai Peninsula and back up to, across over the top of the Red Sea there and back into the Promised Land eventually. Well, lately there's been some archaeological discoveries that have kind of blown this route out of the water. And I have that, but that's going to be, I believe, next week that we have to get into that. So if you're at home, you can watch it on the video. And if you're here, we'll show you where it's at. But as you can see, it went down there, and they could have walked it in about 2.5 weeks. It's 212 nautical miles, which converts to 244 miles. So it's less than 250 miles that they could have walked along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea and been there in about 11 to 14 days. But because of their disobedience, they spent 40 years walking that 244 miles. The delay was caused by their sin. There's no other way to describe it. Sorry, my medicines is working again. They doubted that God could lead them out of this wilderness. It didn't take but how long before they were already murmuring against Moses? They get to Mount Sinai, and he's up on a mountain, and says, we're going to build an idol. We need something to worship. Moses is gone. He may never come back. He may have fell off a cliff up there for all we know. And here we are stuck out here. We better get some help. So what did they do? They sinned, and they lost faith in God. Or if they didn't lose faith, some people have said, some scholars have said it wasn't they lost, that they wanted to worship the calf. They just needed something visual to see. And I kind of dismiss that because I'm thinking they're at Mount Sinai and they can see the presence of God on top of the mountain. They can see the cloud, they can see the fire, they can see the smoke. And yet they say, well, we need something to look at, something we can get closer to, something we can touch. How many people have you run into that that tell you, well, I don't believe there's a God because you can't see him. You can't touch him. He's just a Santa Claus kind of character. He shows up every so often, but not where we can touch him. And those people don't realize where the tabernacle is now. The tabernacle now is within us, nowhere else. So the Israelites trusted in themselves, and God didn't have enough to deliver them enough abilities. So then when they get ready to go into the promised land, they have a problem. They stopped circumcision while they were in the desert. They didn't do that anymore. They didn't observe the Passover out in the desert, which always seems strange to me, why they stopped doing those things. I can understand because they're traveling, might make it a little tough for circumcision, but what about the Passover? That wouldn't have been so bad. They could have done that. They had their stock with them. And I'm sure they ate some of it. I'm sure that they found places where they would come in handy for a trade or two. But it was a desert. There was nothing there for those people. And it cost so many lives over that period of 40 years. All those people, again, it was over 20, were going to die and never see the promised land, including Moses. Moses wasn't going to make it either. So when they weren't allowed to enter the land of milk and honey, anyone, until they did some certain things. And this was the problem. And it's a shadow, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So, trusting in themselves instead of God cost every person in the Exodus departed over 20 years of the age a chance to live in the promised land. This seems cruel, but God says you're going to do it my way. That's one of the main lessons we can take away from that 40 years of wandering, is that God says do it my way and you'll get to the promised land. But if you do it your way, you're going to die. He's very strict about that. He's very, very much a person that's, a personage, a spiritual personage that says, I know what's best for you. He lays out every little inch for these people for 40 years, covers every need that they have, tells them exactly how he wants the tabernacle built, how exactly he wants them to worship, what exactly he wants them to eat. He lays this all out and says, if you do this, you'll be fine. I've got an old tattered book in my library, what little library I've got at home, that's called None of These Diseases. And it was written, years ago. But it still holds true. When you read through this book, you find out what God did to protect his children. Well, let's talk about the unclean stuff that they couldn't eat. Well, now we understand a little bit why. They couldn't eat shellfish. They couldn't go eat a lobster or any shrimp or crawfish, if you're from Louisiana. They couldn't eat anything that was what we would consider like seafood other than fish. And the fish had to have scales. Now, if you really talk to the medical people, one of the quickest allergies that sometimes come upon us is from seafood. You can be eating it for years and go and sit down and have a little bit of a shrimp dinner, and all of a sudden your throat's closing and you're swelling up and you're getting rashes. And you never know whether it will happen or not, but it happens a lot to people with seafood. So God says, don't eat that. Well, what about the fish, God? Well, you can eat the fish, but you got to have the ones with scales. Why? And I love catfish, but catfish is a scrounger. They eat junk off the bottom. They eat stuff that's not good. Of course, now we raise them in a pen and in a pond where they don't have to worry about what they're eating. But if you go to Mississippi and pull one of them out of there, better be careful, because they eat a lot of stuff they shouldn't eat. You may wind up glowing in the dark somewhere, because it's bad. But God knew that. He knew that it was good for them to take a shovel and walk a mile and a quarter out of the camp in order to keep the disease down, to bury their waste. They were the first ones that really practiced sanitary aspects of bathroom work. Rome didn't do it. Rome had by the time I got there, they had these long outhouses, I would call them, with 20 or 30 holes for you and a bunch of fig leaves for you to clean up with. That's how far they got. Well, God was a little bit ahead of the curve. And he said, we're going to take care of that. We're going to move you in such a way. Circumcision, he said on the 8th day. Well, we know now that on the 8th day that there's a chemical in our systems that is never as proficient, what's the word I'm looking for? Never as much of it in you as there is on the 8th day of your life. And this is part of what helps your blood to clot. So this was why God says 8 days, your system's going to be more easily accompanying this procedure. That's all in that little book, and it's just amazing when you go through and you see all the things that he did. Where women was considered unclean, there was a reason for it. Where they went through a period in their menstrual period where they would go and cleanse themselves and be allowed back into society. But it was to keep any disease down, because blood is life, but it's also the transformer of disease. What about, the one we got there, Carteroy disease that's going around now? It's not Carteroy, I'd like to call it that, but it's... But I'm talking about this, it's airborne, but it gets into the blood system and it attacks your lungs, it attacks your heart, it attacks a lot of things, and it's all through the blood system. We get it inside of our body and the blood transfers it. God's saying, I'm going to take care of all that. And that, even with that witness that they had, if it was just water and food would have been enough. But he took care of them even beyond that. The shadow the Israelites cast reminds us of how quickly and how easily Satan can destroy Christians in their journey to Christ. If you think about it, they weren't very far before they were tempted. They got to the mountain of Sinai, which was only probably a day or two travel. We'll look at it a little closer next week when we see them actually begin the journey. But they were what we can visualize as a shadow of what Satan will do to us. He'll be right there on our journey too. I consider Christianity a journey to God. We're walking back into that kingdom that we're going to spend in heaven, and Satan's right along with us, trying to push us out of line. And he's good at it. You just think of all the people that were lost here in Israel, in their desert. 3 million people who had to depend on the tabernacle. That was their focus point. That was what they guarded. That was telling them God was present with them. How important is that for us? To know that God is with us. That he actually dwells within us, not in a tent anymore, not in a temple anymore. We've become the temples. We've become the tabernacles. We now are dependent upon God because we are the tabernacle. People who had to defend the sanctuary. Every day when you walk out of here, you may have to defend your Christianity. Some countries right now are defending it with their lives. People are getting killed because they're Christian. We're very fortunate in this country we don't have to face that, at least at this point. But who knows what tomorrow might bring. And we have to defend that sanctuary, that place where God dwells. But we defend it as being Christians. We defend it the way Jesus defended it. By loving our brothers and loving God. That's the two things. That's our jobs. Their job was to depend upon it and defend it. Even though they could see his presence dwelling among them in the cloud and in the pillar of fire, yet they still separated from him. We got to be careful that we don't do the same. Our cloud and our pillar of fire is the scriptures. We need to be looking at them diligently, reminding us that God's presence is here with us. The 3 million people who did not yet see that he will dwell in the hearts of his children through his Son. They couldn't see that. That was looking ahead. They had no future eyesight, if you would. They couldn't see in the future. They could barely see in the past because they forgot that pretty quickly. We, on the other hand, can look back. Again, this is why we mentioned in the very first lesson why we study in the Old Testament. To remind us what's coming, to see how that all fits in God's plan to bring his Son into this world so that he could dwell not in a tent, not in a temple, but in our hearts. And all the nations shall be blessed. There we go. Next week, we're going to get there. Okay, we're going to start that journey and see how they traveled and see where they went and look at some of the processes that have changed because of archaeological discoveries. So I hope you'll be with us then. And until then, for those of you that are home, God bless. And for those of you that are here, the same. God bless you. We'll start again next week. I think I'm close.